Okay, let's do some basics. So I'm going to switch over to the model, to FLAC2D. Okay, so I'm still getting this really wonky looking layout. It's very much due to the change in the resolution. You know, this is a 4K screen, or at least a high resolution. For the projector, we're using a lower resolution. So I'm going to exit out. And it is in part to do with the way I've invoked this. But if you right click on the shortcut, the executable file, under properties, there's a compatibility tab. And it all has to do with these DPI settings. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to override it from the application to the system, to Windows. OK, apply. OK. And hopefully, when I start it up now, yeah. And I'm going to select that recent project that I had and just things around a little bit. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you bring it up and the resolution looks wonky, you know, maybe you've switched from a laptop to a different laptop, look for the compatibility tab. Just right click onto the executable or the shortcut. And now that that's set, when I use that in the future, it'll remember that. Okay, so this first exercise, and I'm going to make that a little bit bigger for you. I'm holding down the control key and I'm using my wheel on the mouse. You could also just make the font larger under the options that I showed you. And one thing that's I think is kind of cool with the way that we've set up this editor is if I highlight, so if I just hit this arrow, it'll execute the whole content of this page. And we won't really garner anything from it because we're using a lot of the same variables, and they'll just write over each other. So I can right click on this highlighted text and I can run the selection. So it'll just run that little snippet of code. And so that's a good way for checking, or if you just want to run part of your model and see what that's going to do. So when I do that, I get some information printed to the console. So here we've got the console. And that's basically like an output screen at its basic level. So let's look at this a little. First of all, we had to create a fish function because we're going to be doing some math. And at its very simplest, it's just an expression. So we've got the command fish defined. We've ended it. I have a habit of typing end right away just so you don't forget. And then the function name is ABC. But we also have a fish variable called ABC. And let me just bring up the global symbols. Okay, so we can see here we've got ABC has a value of 71 now that we've run it. And we see here the output was 71 as well. So 22 times 3 plus 5 is 71. So if I just do a model new and run this little bit of code, discard the old bit, you see ABC is now 0. That's because I've refreshed the code. And even though I've run this, because I haven't actually, I've put it into memory, but I haven't actually run it. In order to run the function, we have to either invoke it with its name in these square brackets, or in this case, we've added a command called list. So list in some variable in these square brackets will print to the console what the value of that variable is. And because the fish function and the fish function and the fish variable have the same name, it'll invoke and output the value of that fish variable inside all at once. If we had called this Fred, then we wouldn't list Fred because it's not being calculated if we didn't change the name here to Fred. So if this is Fred, ABC equals, we would just invoke Fred. We'd see the value gets updated, but list is just a way for us to print it to the screen. So when we run that, you see that the command list is shown here. And then the value 71 is an integer displays. In part 2, what we're simply doing is converting 22 to be a variable. So ABC equals HH times 3 plus 5, but we're predefining HH. And when we do that, we would hope we would get the same value, which we do, 71. But you notice here, we see HH is listed now as a global variable. If we had made HH a local variable, you would still calculate, you'd still get the value of ABC, but you wouldn't even see HH as a variable in the global list. Okay, so with this one, I'm going to run this first few lines, not the list ABC, but we're essentially using these fish fragments to redefine the values of ABC and HH to be 0. So when I run that, they're both 0. We said to list HH, which it did, which is 0. So when we list ABC, it's actually going to both invoke the fish function ABC, and it's going to display the value of ABC. Okay, which is 71, which is what happened before. Then you might think, well, didn't we just set HH to be 0? So wouldn't that value change? Well, of course, once you invoke this function, it goes back up here. It redefines HH to be 22, and then it calculates it as before. So in that sense, always make sure what's happening in the function is what you want it to be. If you wanted that value to be 0, then we wouldn't define it again inside the function. We could still define it externally like we did. And in fact, we'll look at it in a minute, but we can add arguments, we can feed in, as we're calling the fish function, we can add in a value that it will interpret and use to calculate. So we'll see that in a minute. Okay, part 4. So what we're going to do here is just get a sense of the different types of variables that we can have. Integers, floats, or decimals, string. Notice that the string is green. The numbers are blue. Obviously, we can multiply variables that are numbers. We can also add string. So if we have a string called have a nice day, and we add it to a string, comma space, old chap, then that text will get added as EE. So one thing here, you notice I have a note to fix this. If I try to run this, we'll actually get an error message here. And it's kind of telling us, this didn't turn green. So there's something wrong here. I actually copied and pasted that from like a slide. And when it pasted these as curly quotes, a single curly quote, whereas we use a straight quote. So if I go here and change that to 2 straight quotes, this is now green, it's string, everybody's happy. Just something to watch if you're copying from like a slide deck or even a manual or the appendix of somebody's thesis. We can have vectors, matrices, Boolean logic, true, false. There are a number of these math utility functions, so we can find the maximum value of a list or an array. We can create a list, and lists are are recommended over arrays. They're just more useful, and there's a lot more functionality and utility for that. So, and lists are interesting because they can be mixed type. We've got strings, floats, integers, even a function for math.py. The software doesn't like curly brackets, but you can use a single straight bracket or a double quote as well. Either works. Also notice here, this line is split. So if we've got a line and it's, say, really long, it's not so long here, but it could even be a command. If you've got a command and you've got to put 10 properties in, you could issue them as a set of commands with properties and just spread it out that way. Or we can add these 3 dots at the end. They'll turn green and essentially hit enter. And then the fish will recognize, or really this editor will recognize that you want to continue on the next line. And it notes that with a couple of things. There's a line here, just to tell you that these 2 lines are connected. But you also see this ampersand symbol for the line. So 35 and 36 are considered one thing, whether it's a function or a command. And you can have more than 2. So a lot of times people will do, like, zone property, and they'll do 3 properties, but you don't necessarily want them to fall off the screen, because if you're going back and you're looking for bugs or something that's not right, you'll always be constantly sliding back and forth. And then I put this in because as a grad student, I got kind of messed up with this. In the old days, it mattered if you were dividing an integer by a float, a decimal, or vice versa. And sometimes you do something like 4/3. I think I was calculating the volume of the sphere. I was doing 4/3 pi, whatever. And it was like rounding that to like an integer. And so obviously you can't get the wrong answer. But long story short, they fixed that, so it doesn't matter what you do. Whether you divide a float by an integer, float by a float, 2 integers, it fixes that, so it will always be correct. So let's run this by highlighting it. And we're going to want to include have1, which is the name of the function. It's referring to that string. And I'm just going to run that selection. So now we see a lot of global symbols here. We can also, if you prefer, there's a command called fish list. And what that will do is it will just put that same information into a fish symbols tab down here. And you can see things like, okay, I can't make that bigger. But hopefully you can see that we have this variable cc, which is string, have a nice day. And we added that to old chap in EE. So when we see EE, you can see that it's combined those 2 strings into one. There's also all sorts of string utilities. So if you want to find the 5th letter of that string, or do a lot more advanced sort of string manipulation, similar to what you could do in Excel, those are all available. So we have this thing called a list, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but essentially it's just a sequence of data. And in this case, if we were to look at KK here, we see that the type is a list, but the value is a size of 6. So it's a list with 6 things in it, but I don't know what those 6 things are. I mean, we know because we can see it here. So a really helpful thing is this other command called list fish contents, and then the fish variable. And when we run that, if I go back to the console, I can now see list fish contents of KK, and I can see the index. There's 6 things there. I can see what types they are and what their actual values are. And as you hopefully use lists more and more, which is really the way we're going, is more lists, because with lists we can get into all sorts of data manipulation, and then we can get into something that's called splitting, which I hopefully get to by the end, which will give you a lot of power and a lot of speed. This fish is now multi-threaded, so you can take advantage of all the threads and run your fish functions much, much faster than we could with just FLAC. And then in part, that's because we weren't really maintaining FLAC's fish, and so it kind of was falling behind the rest of the software. But with FLAC2D, everything's, you can take advantage of all these new things.